So far, we've talked about economic structuralism primarily in terms of what it's most interested in, which is economics and inequality. But any theory of international politics has to, or is expected at least, to take on this question of war and peace. So what I want to talk about now, or ask about, is how does economic structuralism explain war and peace? And there are a couple of sort of famous ones. The classic structuralist explanation is basically this: capitalism leads to imperialism, and imperialism leads to war. And the first famous study that laid this out was by an English publicist named John Hobson, who published this book in 1902 called Imperialism, a Study. And Hobson was himself, I don't think, really identified as a Marxist as much as an advocate of peace and an anti-imperialist. Lenin, writing a sort of propaganda article or book in the middle of World War I, very explicitly took Hobson's article, or Hobson's book rather, took its argument and turned it into an explicitly Marxist argument in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And his argument was that capitalism leads inevitably to war between the great powers. Right? Marxists are big on inevitable arguments because they see history as mechanistic, being driven by economic factors. And essentially the argument in both of these books was that the competition for raw materials and markets eventually will bring great powers into conflict with each other. And of course, many critics of capitalism since then have made similar arguments, even if not quite as mechanistic as Lenin's. So what's the argument? Well, World War I is again a place where it's easy to apply this, and Lenin himself was specifically explaining World War I because that's what he was concerned about at the time. In this view, the long peace of the 19th century that we've talked about, that long period of mostly peace between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and and World War I, was made possible by imperialism. In other words, the capitalists of Europe could get all the raw materials they need by going and exploiting new colonies in Asia and Africa. This was really the boom of the British Empire in India, but also its expansion to other places. And of course, this was the period in which all of Africa essentially got carved up. Eventually, though, the argument is that by the end of the 19th century, the Earth, the entire planet, had more or less been carved up. And so there were no new territories to capture. And because of that, then, if the great industrial firms of Europe wanted either more raw materials or more places to sell their stuff, the only way to get them was by taking each other's colonies. And the only way to do that was to defeat them in Europe. Moreover, Marxists argue that the fragility of the capitalist profits in Europe, that is to say, the fact that capitalism was inherently unstable and led the firms to need support from government. And the way that the government supported them was to buy weapons. Lastly, they point out that because of the kinds of things that Marx predicted, there were growing revolutionary movements, growing socialist movements in Europe around the time of the turn of the 20th century, and that the leading powers of Europe saw war as a way of delaying or deferring revolution. So in a variety of ways, economic structuralists, as well as Marxists of different varieties, see World War I as a direct result of capitalism. And Lenin argued, right, that under capitalism, this would happen again and again and again. There is an opposite argument that many prominent Marxists of the same period made, and that a lot of people have made since. And the argument essentially is that there's another possibility of stable capitalism. In this view, you get this sort of hyper-capitalism in which there's a global class of capitalists who collaborate in exploitation rather than going to war. And to people who hold this view, this explains the long peace among the major capitalist powers since World War II. And when we see the great boom in free trade that happens really beginning in the well, really after World War II, but then the boom in global financial movements that begins in the 1980s and 90s, they say this is all a single group of capitalists taking over the world, and it's not going to lead to war. What it's going to lead to is very stable exploitation. And so this view, rather than seeing a conflict of interest among the great capitalists of different countries, it sees a commonality of interest between all these capitalists. And it increasingly, of course, sees them as a single group. What's the problem? There's a big problem here, which is that neither problem really explains variation very well. Neither of these approaches kind of explains why there's peace for a while and then war, and then there's peace. And so explaining variation is really important to most of our social science explanations, but especially to explaining something like war, which sometimes we have it, sometimes we don't. So this is the question that I think these theories struggle with, which is why is there war then in some cases but not others? And then the question to leave you with is, which of these versions do you find most compelling? And to be clear, we're going to dig much further into the questions of war and peace later on in the course.